Hi, this is Rod Faulkner, and you are listening to the 7thmatrix.com Eye on Sci-Fi podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 187 of the 7thmatrix.com Eye on Sci-Fi podcast. The podcast where we share with you terrific indie science fiction and fantasy, online short films, web series, and other closely related media. We also, on occasion, have conversations with the talented creators who are producing outstanding indie speculative work. Thank you for joining me on this very special episode with a very distinguished guest. Joseph Joe Mallozzi is a television script writer, executive producer, and showrunner who is best known for his tenure on the iconic science fiction television franchise Stargate SG-1 that also includes the spin-offs Stargate Atlantis and Stargate Universe. I have had the pleasure of being acquainted with Joe for several years now online, and I am thrilled to have him on the podcast to discuss his illustrious career in television that also includes his executive producing and showrunning his co-creation, the television series Dark Matter, and his oversight on the Hulu sci-fi series Utopia Falls. It is a terrific and fascinating conversation. So without further ado, please enjoy the Eye on Sci-Fi podcast conversation with Joe Mallozzi. Joe Mallozzi, finally, I can say, welcome to Eye on Sci-Fi podcast.
It is so great to be here. I was wondering, when is Rod going to invite me?
Well, you know what? I'm going to be very frank and honest with you. I was a little intimidated because at the time you had so much going on. You were wrapping up Stargate. You had launched Dark Matter. Then you launched Utopia Falls. And I thought, Joe is too busy. I didn't want to kind of infringe on your time.
Well, I would always make time for you, Rod, of course. As you pointed out, we go back to 2015.
Yes.
I guess we started off as Twitter buddies. And one of the things I always tell writers looking to get into the business is get on social media, but especially Twitter, that it allows you to kind of connect with other industry professionals and other people of like mind. In this case, our mutual affection for science fiction.
Absolutely.
So, it never hurts to ask. I always try to be as approachable as possible online.
You absolutely are. And I'm learning that as I go, that it never hurts to ask. The worst someone can say is no. And for my listeners who may not be familiar, Joe reached out to me on Twitter back in 2015 when he launched Dark Matter, and he did a written Q&A. And I don't know if you remember that or not, Joe, but it's still active on the site. And I'm going to include a link to that so that listeners can go and check that out. But I kind of wanted to start our conversation off with you because you have such a long and illustrious career in sci-fi. But I remember a question that you answered that really stuck with me. It kind of touched me, actually. And I asked you your origin story in terms of who or what first inspired your love of science fiction, and you answered your mom. Would you speak on that a little more, please?
Yeah, when I was growing up, I was always an avid reader. I'm fond of telling everyone when I was in elementary school, I had the complete works of William Shakespeare, this leather-bound edition that I would take with me everywhere, and I would transcribe the various acts into this duotang. And my mother was very heartened because I always told her I wanted to be a writer. And then I shifted focus to comic books, and I love comic books. And my mother, I wouldn't say she was disappointed, but she was a little concerned. So she saw science fiction as a compromise, I think. And so she started to gift me books, Asimov or Arthur C. Clarke, Harlan Ellison in particular, I loved. And that's where my love of science fiction began. And it was really nurtured by my mother, who would always gift me those books.
That's awesome. See, and I'm very close to my mom, who fortunately I still have with me, but she and her mother, my grandmother, were avid readers. And so I loved books. I mean, I was the biggest blurred Black nerd for you all that are asking what that means. And of course, Joe, you and I, when we were nerds, it really wasn't cool to like comic books. I know that a lot of the adults when I were growing up would say, okay, what's wrong with this child over here? Why is he not playing basketball? Why is he sitting here with all these books? And my idea of fun during the summers when I was growing up, my mom took me to the local library and they gave out junior library cards. And you could check out about 8 books at a time. That's what I did all summer. I would go and check out 8 books, read them, go and check out 8 books. So yeah, that definitely resonates with me, your answer about your mother kind of, inciting that passion for reading and for sci-fi in you, because the same. My mom doesn't like sci-fi, but she loves books.
Yeah. As my former creative writing teacher would say, you're a voracious reader.
And I think that's a good thing. So, Joe, I do know that you started off in animation before you joined Stargate.
Yes.
SG-1, where I think you joined, was it in the 4th season? Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay. So what was the transition like from writing and working on animation to a live action series?
Another thing I always tell up and coming writers is if you want to get your foot in the door in the industry, a roundabout way to go about it is to knock on animation's door, which is how I did it. To be honest with you, I really wanted to get into live action, but those doors were not open to me. And one of the production companies I happened to query was an animation studio, and they responded, as most did not. They told me, well, we're not looking for someone to come in and read script, be an internal script reader, but if you're interested in pitching for one of our shows, and they told me how it works, they would send me a series Bible. I would come up with pitches, and if they like one of our pitches, they would buy it, and I would write a script. And that's how I got my start in the industry. And I did actually quite well in the industry. And I went from animation and transitioned to live action teen sitcom. I did a series called Student Bodies that I wrote and produced with my former writing partner, Paul Mully, and then made the leap to cheesy one hour action adventure, and then ultimately landed on Stargate. And I have to say, a lot of it is luck, to be honest with you. We just happen to have an agent who represented Robert Cooper, who was one of the executive producers of Stargate. And he had heard from Robert that they were looking for writers, or they were having trouble finding staff writers. And so he submitted Paul and I, and they read us and they liked us and they allowed us to pitch, and we pitched a couple of ideas. One of them was our first episode, which was Scorched Earth. The second one was what would turn out to be Window of Opportunity, which became a fan favorite. And that's how we got our foot in the door. But it was, as I said, a roundabout way through animation. And yet at the same time, I found animation very rewarding in that it allowed me to hone my craft. It forces you to think visually. And also you get paid while you do it, which is great.
Yeah, that's important too. Would you consider going back to animation?
I would if it was the right project. Absolutely.
How about creating one?
Yes, as well.
Like you don't have enough on your plate.
No, actually, I would if something in the sci-fi realm in animation would greatly appeal to me.
Oh, that's fantastic. And I would have to argue with you, Joe, about one statement you made. You said it's really luck. I do agree that's part of it, but you were prepared and you also had a desire to enter into live action. So when that opportunity presented itself, you were ready.
Yes, I agree. I would say I was lucky. I think I have a certain skill. So
I would agree.
I'll agree. And I've always been somewhat ambitious, so I'm not averse to knocking on doors.
Right.
But then again, I look at other people in the industry, and I know a lot of very talented people who just haven't been very fortunate and don't work. Whereas I see a lot of very untalented people, frankly, who do work all the time. So
yeah. So it is a toss-up sometimes. It comes down to it, but it's best to be prepared. So you joined SG-1, and I know you've been interviewed ad nauseum about your time on Stargate. And I was thinking, okay, Rod, you've got Joe. How are you going to approach this in a different direction? And I think what I'm going to do is just ask you overall, because Stargate SG-1 is one of those sci-fi franchises that still has such an ardent, passionate fan base across the world. And I wanted to ask you, why do you think that is? What is it about Stargate that just incites such passion in the fans?
I think the lessons I learned working on Stargate, one was that viewers will tune in for the hook, but they stay for the characters. And really, for instance, in SG-1, it was very much that foursome, Jack, Sam, Daniel, and Teal'c. Secondly, is this idea of a second family to viewers. And I look at all successful sci-fi, and I find they have similarities in that they're always very character-driven, and there's always that sense of family. To that, I would add, often there's an underlying sense of humor that I think appeals to audiences, especially sci-fi audiences. So those three things more than anything. And then one of the things that made SG-1 particularly unique was that, unlike a lot of far future sci-fi, this was a near future sci-fi or a present day sci-fi, in that the conceit was that it existed, the Stargate program existed in the here and now, but of course it was being kept secret. And so, in a way, it was different than a lot of the shows out there. Although, I mean, I think X-Files mined that formula very well. And I think Fringe did as well, if I'm not mistaken.
I would agree. And you speak of X-Files and Fringe is something else that Stargate SG-1 had. And also this ties into, you were talking about, it was a familial feeling on the show. But I don't think anyone has ever really discussed this, at least to my knowledge, about Samantha Carter. And I bring her up because your core main cast on SG-1 were all fantastic. But it was something about Samantha Carter that really drew me to her character. It is because this is not only a capable military career woman, but a brilliant scientist. Amanda Tapping was phenomenal in her portrayal of Samantha. She really was. But this was at a time where public conversations about women and girls in STEM careers really hadn't made the public discourse. And that's what I really loved about Stargate SG-1. Samantha was never objectified. She was not an accessory to somebody else's story. She was part of that core cast. So over the years, what have women and girls, what type of reception have you received from them? Have you heard from them about Samantha?
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the things that really heartens me whenever I hear from fandom are occasionally the women who were inspired by the character of Samantha Carter and went into the sciences and now have careers as scientists, and are raising daughters to, potentially follow in their footsteps. It makes me proud of what we created, but what we collaborated on with Amanda, who you said was amazing. And, on and off screen, she was great. Her character, it was frankly a tough character to play, simply because as the character who handled the science sphere, if you will, she had to deliver the technobabble, as we used to call it, in a believable manner. And she would go out and she would research so that she would know or get a fair handle on exactly what she was talking about.
Wow.
And no one did it like her. Occasionally we would have guest stars who would come in and do technobabble, and we'd realize Amanda is just in a class all her own.
Oh, yeah. Well, speaking of technobabble, of course, we don't have a Stargate. There isn't a Stargate command in real life. But did you all ever have like scientific or technical advisors on the show?
We did in the later seasons. Mika McKinnon. We had Carl Binder's daughter who would vet his scripts, I think. We had author John Scalzi during the Stargate Universe's run, who would vet all the scripts as well. But Brad Wright especially was very interested in the science aspects of science fiction. And so he became kind of the guy we would always run the crazier ideas by over the course of Stargate's run. And he was the one who would always have the kind of more, I would say, scientifically grounded notions and story ideas.
Oh, that's fantastic. Mm-hmm. Well, listen, also too, another aspect of your time at Stargate, because I definitely want to, I'm checking my notes, touch on Dark Matter and Utopia Falls. But I heard you mention this in another interview. I think it is brilliant, and our listeners definitely would appreciate it. Please share what the LTS philosophy is.
Yes, LTS. So this was during season 4 of SG1, and we were looking to cast. And as would often happen, we would be looking to cast. We would send our script to our LA casting director, and he would send back a list of potential actors for the role. And I saw one actor I loved, and I thought, well, he would be great. Why don't we cast him? And Brad's response was LTS. And I asked, what is LTS? And he says, life's too short. And I learned that it was a motto that he and Rob had adopted, Robert Cooper, over the course of SG1's run. So their philosophy was show business, or the type of work we did, was so hard. It didn't need to be any harder. We didn't need to work with assholes. So by the time Paul and I joined in season 4, we were very fortunate in that, A, the production was a well-oiled machine, because everybody knew what they had to do. And Brad and Robert just ran a very efficient production. But more importantly, they didn't want to work with assholes. So they would vet everybody before they came on as best we could. And it was a lesson that stuck with me. And so when it came time to run or create and run the show that I created, Dark Matter, I remembered LTS. And that was my philosophy throughout. And when people ask me, what is my fondest memory of working in television? One of the fondest certainly is all the times guest stars came to do Dark Matter, and I'd run into them on set and I'd ask how they were doing, and they would just talk about what a positive work environment it was. And a lot of it, of course, much of it has to do with hiring great people. And a lot of it also has to do with efficiencies, just being prepared. A lot of productions, I hate to say it, are not prepared. They're writing outlines on cocktail napkins. They're basically rewriting scripts the night before. Preparation just goes such a long way towards creating that kind of peaceful, upbeat on-set spirit, and also just ensuring sort of production runs smoothly. You make your days more or less. Everybody goes home at a decent hour. You have your weekends to yourself and your family. Yeah. It's little things like that we took for granted on Stargate that I only realized after Stargate were atypical of the industry.
Yeah, because difficult sets are legendary. And of course, stories have filtered down to the public too about that. And I think that you truly can tell when a production is well run, when the cast members get along. There's a feeling to it. There's a tone. And when there's friction, it's just like you say, it's difficult on everyone trying to get the show out. But then it does something about the tone that I think audiences sometimes can pick up on.
Yeah.
And you never felt that with SG1. The cast.
No, they were all great. I mean, Michael Shanks played Daniel, ended up leaving after season 5. He and I had fairly different philosophical views of the show that were fairly public at the time. But I mean, I like Michael a lot. I think he's a fantastic actor. I love the character of Daniel, and I was happy to see him come back. So not to say we never had disagreements. We certainly had disagreements, but I mean, it was always very respectful. But as you said, there are a lot of productions where that's not the case, where it's actually a miserable working environment. And a lot of it has to do with the people that are hired. And a lot of that has to do with the people who are doing the hiring. Right. So I think they are equally culpable.
Right. It starts from the top down.
Yes.
Speaking of hiring, now, I know you've been asked, and I have to ask you about cast and guest stars, but writers, your writing team is the heart of any production. Yes. And so how do you decide which writers to hire in terms of, do they get the sensibility of the show and the vision that you all have for it? Because that's critical, and that they mesh, again, that they get the sensibility and the tone, they mesh with the other writers, and you form this unit. Because I'm sure SG1 was a well-oiled machine, and of course, Dark Matter and the other spinoffs. But how do you go about doing that when you're trying to build at first a writing staff?
Sensibility and tone have everything to do with it. And it's hard to get a sense of a writer's sensibility, ability to capture the sensibility and tone of your show by necessarily reading their scripts. But a good script, a script is a good script. But we've always found that on Stargate in particular, it was always very difficult or very challenging to find writers simply because the show went on for so long and it was so mythologically dense that unless you were a fan of the series, it was a very hard show to get.
Right.
And so that was the challenge with Stargate. Dark Matter, I have to admit, as a showrunner, I learned a lot of lessons on Dark Matter, what I kind of passed on to R.T. Thorne, who was the creator of Utopia Falls, because he kind of made the same mistakes I did in his first season. And just this, I guess, desire to micromanage is one way of putting it, but really wanting to control all aspects of production, because in essence, it is your baby.
Right. So
I look back on Dark Matter, and just because in terms of tone, I'd liken it to like Stargate, SG-1, and Atlantis had a kind of an underlying sense of humor, but it was very character driven, and at the same time, it was like a very hard show to get. So I remember that first season, also just because we didn't have a lot of money to make the show, was Paul and I. And for the first season, we brought in Martin Garrow, who would go on to do Blind Spot, and he's on showrunning Quantum Leap now.
Okay.
And we just sat in a room, and over 2.5 weeks, we ended up breaking the entire first season, which is fast in this business. But I knew the stories I wanted to tell. I'd been sitting on the show for almost 7 years, and then I ended up writing 7 out of 13 episodes, and then doing rewrites on everything. So at the end of the day, it's really finding writers who can get as close to capturing the voice of your characters, or more than the characters, really the tone of your show, as possible. And then when it came to Utopia Falls, given the subject matter, we obviously wanted to have the best writers with the strongest voices, and obviously a diverse representation in the room. And so in the case of Utopia Falls, and obviously, anything moving forward would follow that pattern. But unfortunately, Utopia Falls didn't go past the first season. But like Dark Matter, I think what I would have loved to have done is really promote from within. So story editing is almost kind of a thankless job, in that these story editors are in the room, they're taking the notes, they're essentially production assistants or the writer's assistants, and they will go out and get the lunch orders, and they do all the grunt work, and they have aspirations to write.
Right.
And the best thing you can do for them is to give them the opportunity to write. And so Trevor Finn, who was our story editor in season 1 of Dark Matter, got to write. Alison Hepburn in season 2, she got to write. Ivan Bartok, who was our on-set producer, got an opportunity to write. And it would have been the same case in Utopia Falls if we have gotten that second season. Utopia Falls was kind of a different animal in that, as I said, I didn't create the show. R.T. Thorne did. And so I was, I guess, a little more hands-off in certain respects. One of the things I told R.T. once I came on board was that this is your show, and I'm going to make the best show possible and sort of try to adhere to your vision. But whenever you feel comfortable enough to take over a showrunner, let's say after season 1, I'm happy to step aside and consult and let you run. And as I said, it's unfortunate that we never got the chance to do a second season.
Yeah, with Utopia Falls, I want to touch on that because I loved how music and pop culture was integrated organically into the core mythology of that show, and I miss it. I really was disappointed that it did not get a second season. And of course, it did debut too at a very chaotic time, the pandemic and all of that. And so, but I was still kind of hoping that somehow there would be a second season, and I miss it. But what was it like incorporating music into a science fiction show? Because that was quite different from anything you had done before.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you. I did not even want to do the show at first. I met RT at a showrunner director meetup, and we hit it off, and he was very complimentary about Dark Matter. So I was like, well, let's grab lunch. And we went out for lunch, and we sat for, I think, 2 or 3 hours. Wow. And he told me about Utopia Falls, and he was going out to pitch it. He didn't have a script, and it was such a unique idea. And he was like, oh, I'm going to Hulu to pitch it next week. And I was like, good luck. And it was such a long shot. And then he called me up a week later, and he's like, Hulu bought the show. I need a showrunner. Wow. And I thought he was asking me for a suggestion. And I told him, honestly, I don't know who would be good for this show. It's like,
and he said, you.
Sci-fi. He was like, yes, he said, you. And I said, no, I'm not good for this. I'm not hip hop. And he's like, no, I'm hip hop. Because he's won more awards, I think, music video awards, as a music video awards director, than anyone in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
He's done stuff for Drake and all the heavy hitters. And he's like, no, I'm hip hop. You're sci-fi. And I was like, no, I don't. This, it's just, it doesn't feel like a good fit. He's like, look, read. I'm going to send you over the package. You read it and you come in and meet the production people, the production. And so I went in, and as I said, I liked what was there, but I didn't think it was for me. But I was very honest with him, and I said, look, I really like what you have. However, if I was going to showrun, this is how I proceed. I think you should move this here, change this here. And I was just very honest with them, and didn't think anything of it. And then the next day, my agent was like, they made you the offer. And I was like, I don't think I can do it. He's like, you know what? Just counter. If you were going to make the show, what would you need to do it? And I said, okay, to be honest with you, I need my own on-set producer. That's Ivan Bartok, just a guy, because when we get into production, I don't usually carry a writer's room. I am the writer's room. So I'm doing all the rewrites and I'm doing all the prep. So I really can't be on set. And because I can't be on set, I need someone who is in the writer's room with me, who knows how to direct, who knows what I will need in the editing room, and who knows tonally what I need from the performances. And so I said, I need him. I want my own visual effects guy. I want my own production designer. In this case, I wanted to bring in Ian Brock, who I'd worked with on Dark Matter, who is, everyone describes as a mad genius. And ultimately, I wanted my own line producer, who really is the money man, who handles the budget. Right. And I thought they were never going to let me have my own line producer, but they said yes to everything. And so thus, I accepted the...
Couldn't refuse.
Yes, I could not refuse. And I ended up hiring my old Dark Matter crew for the most part. And we rolled into production, and it was tough. Like Dark Matter, or even more so than Dark Matter, we didn't have a lot of money to make the show, but we had some very talented people. We had... Very much so. Yeah, and it was just a lot of fun to make. And the cast were, young kids, but they were great. And when I do my next show, I'll certainly bring them in for at least an audition.
Oh, that's wonderful. So what did you learn from your experience on Utopia Falls, Joe?
That's an interesting question. I like to think as a showrunner, RT learned a lot, much the same way that I learned a lot as a showrunner on Dark Matter in those early years, and that you hire the best people and then you trust them to do their job. Just because he was staying there till 10 p.m., he was just kind of obsessing over everything, as I did on Dark Matter. What did I learn? I guess one of the things I learned is not to trust in the production to provide good lunches. Just basically pay for your own lunch. That's that was, I think, my biggest takeaway.
I forget I'm talking to a foodie.
Yes. Well, I still have a picture of one of the sandwiches that they brought in. It was 2 pieces of bread, the thinnest slice of tomato. I mean, so thin you could actually read through it, and then a piece of lettuce, and that was the sandwich. It was I titled it "World's Saddest Sandwich." You know what? I'm inspired. I'm going to tweet it out after this interview.
Please do.
I will.
I definitely want to check that out. So I do want to kind of backtrack to the dearly departed Dark Matter, which, oh my God, I went through a lot of emotions, but it really did piss me off, especially when I got insight as to why, because it wasn't the ratings, and it definitely wasn't fan support, lack thereof. When you look back on it, is there anything there's not anything you could have done, Joe, but how can I ask this, or what am I trying to ask?
I could tell you something, what I would have done differently.
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that, as I said, I sat on Dark Matter for, I think, 7 years. And so when we went into production, finally, I had a lot of the episode ideas in my head, certainly for that first season. But I also knew how I wanted to approach it as a 5-season, essentially a 5-season arc.
Right.
Each season would be the equivalent of an installment in a book series. So in the first season, you're introduced to these characters who in the pilot you discover are criminals, the worst of the worst.
Right.
And the first season are peeling the onion, if you will, on the mysteries of their backstories. And then the first season ends with them all going to prison. And I think more than any other season, if the show had been canceled after the first season, it would have been sad for me, but I would have been kind of satisfied. It wouldn't have answered all the questions. I had the answers in my head, but it was somewhat kind of a fitting end. And then season 2 was all about their quest to turn over a new leaf and be better people. Not they knew who they were. And it ends up blowing up spectacularly in their faces, quite literally, with the destruction of EO7, the space station. And then season 3 was the struggle from within, one of their own turning dark side, and the amazing Alex Malari Jr.
Wonderful performance.
Ryo Ishida, who becomes the big bad. And it ends up setting up the alien attack, which would have been the 4th season, which the fight against the aliens, and the 5th season would have been the android insurrection.
Okay.
And so I think one of the things I probably would have done differently is I probably would have closed out the Ryo Ishida storyline as I had planned. I would have brought that what I planned for early season 4 into season 5, and offer a satisfying ending to season 3. And then would have saved the alien incursion for the beginning of season 4. So at least I would offer the fans some semblance of closure.
Yeah, because one thing about your writing that I do like is that when you set up a plot point, like a mystery or a twist, you do pay it off. Like in the first season, it was who is the Turncoat. Yeah, who is the mole? Because there are shows, I'm not going to name names, but there was a very popular show in the early 2000s. You know which one I'm talking about. And first season was brilliant.
I agree. And this is why I said I never want to do a show like that. And it's very frustrating because, pardon me, but it's an FU to the audience, the intelligence of the audience, because you're just making it up as you go along and you start contradicting stuff you wrote in previous episodes, and especially fans who are invested are just so disrespected. And so, to be honest, again, I had the luxury of having sat on this show for 7 years, so I had a lot of advanced planning. And as a result, I mean, little things like in season 1, I think episode 3, the android is about to go off, and 2, played by the amazing Melissa O'Neill, sees off the android, the wonderful Zoe Palmer, and in the airlock, and 2 says to the android, come back, we can't do this without you. And the android stops and says, you can. And, I said to Zoe, the way you deliver that, you kind of deliver it with a kind of a heavy import, like a suggestion that there's something more. I know fans online, some of them reacted and was like, why did she deliver? What does she mean by that? And, other fans were just kind of dismissed it and it was like, oh, it's just how she delivered the line. And then you don't find out until episode 9 that she meant was 2 is very different and almost, akin to an android in many respects. And
that was a great reveal, by the way.
Yeah. But little subtle ones, like also at the end of episode 7, I think it was, with Wendy the android, Sarah, 3's long lost love, she ends up dying, or the power failing in the stasis pod. And I wanted a shot of 5, played by Jadelle Ferland, looking down at her and then kind of cocking her head as though she has a thought. And then we don't say anything about it until season 3, I think a couple of episodes into season 3, where 5's at her computer and suddenly bing, upload finally complete. And she's like, great. And you realize that she has uploaded Sarah's consciousness into the ship. And so little things like that are really fun. And I think really rewarding for longtime viewers, and always sought to do a lot of that so that, you watch the show once, but it's also, you can go back and you can see how we kind of layered in the clues and hopefully make it an equally pleasurable experience on second and multiple viewings.
I can attest to that because I've rewatched Dark Matter, I know, at least twice now, and intend on doing it again. And I always pick up on something that I missed. Like, what? Why did she, why did he do that? Why did she look that
Hopefully
way?
There's a reason for everything and a payoff, or almost everything. There would have been if we had done seasons 4 and 5.
Well, one thing that made Dark Matter so special to me, and I'm sure I can speak for many other fans, is the sense of community. And Joe, something that I want to commend you on is that we talked about this before we recorded, but you are very approachable and you really do take time to engage with the fans. In the good old days of Twitter, I remember on Friday nights having those live tweets with you, and the cast would join in and the fans. And that was really wonderful. And I still look back on that time quite fondly. And then even now, you still share conceptual art, anecdotes about happenings on the set. Why? Because your level of engagement, and I know you are aware of this, is atypical. But why is that so important to you to do that?
It started with Stargate. And before we landed on the show, I wanted to do my research. So I went online and I started to engage with the various fan forums and kind of found out sort of their take on Stargate and their favorite episodes and their take on the characters. And so I found it very informative. And so when I ended up landing on the show, I decided to pay them back by continuing to be accessible online. And that, frankly, is a bit of a double-edged sword, given the fact that fans are very passionate.
Right.
And if they like what you're doing, they'll let you know. And if they don't like what you're
doing, they will
definitely let you know. And so my writing partner at the time, Paul Mully, was not on the internet at all. And he was like, why do you go through this aggravation? And he was very happy to just live his life. But I always find it interesting, kind of the fan takes and kind of the fan wars and what sets them off and what they love. And just because I've always been a fan of comic books, of science fiction, of horror. And I just think that as a fan myself, I would very much treasure the opportunity to interact with the people who made the stuff that I loved growing up.
Right.
And so I've always kind of been mindful of that and tried to be very approachable through my blog, kind of, even though I do blog every day, it's kind of, the popularity has waned over time. It ebbs and flows with production. When I'm in production, then things pick up. Right. Otherwise, things are fairly quiet, but mostly on Twitter. And, I know Twitter has gone through the changes and it's very
chaotic.
It is chaotic, but I think there is no better forum to get up-to-date information and to connect with other people, either in the industry or just people you would probably never be able to connect to on sort of a daily basis. So I try to keep the door open, and I'll see how it all works out in the end.
Well, Joe, I appreciate it. Thank you for being so open and generous with your time and being so approachable. I also wanted to ask you too, because I love comic books as well, but I don't read a lot of the big two anymore like I used to. I'm mainly independent based. But have you ever considered maybe dipping your hand back into writing comics again?
In fact, I have. I've been in talks. I can't reveal too much. This guy is a comic book heavyweight. I love his stuff. And he and his partners have reached out to me about potentially doing a comic book. And so I pitched them I think 3 ideas, and they really responded well to 2. And we picked one that we would start with. And so I think there's a publisher on board. We're just looking for an artist. And so hopefully once we get the artist's approval, we'll hit the ground running on that. In the meantime, I've hired a comic book agent, Rick Lewis, who is going to represent me. And I sent him a couple of ideas. And we're going out with one, Henry Fong, who was a concept artist on not only Dark Matter, but I think the Star Treks and a lot of like the big shows.
Wow.
He was also a big comic book fan. We're going to team up for a couple of comic books, we're out pitching. So, comic books are very much in the mix. And, as I said, I always grew up writing comic books, and I wrote the Dark Matter comic book, kind of a, very interesting experience. But Dark Matter comic book was kind of a bittersweet experience in that, we wrote the first 4 issues, and then that was it. We never really got to finish or continue the story. So really, more than anything, I want to create a comic book that will allow me to tell my story how I want to tell my story. And if it gets picked up, as an adaptation, great. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't, I don't care. I just want to be able to tell my story. And as I said, I have much respect for comic book creators and the medium. So I would very much love the opportunity to play in that sandbox.
Well, I am very intrigued and I cannot wait till we can find out more about that. And one last topic on Dark Matter, because it was canceled before you could finish the story. Have you ever thought about maybe finishing it in maybe another graphic novel or a novel per se?
Yeah, I was approached about completing it as a novel. And I'm, as I said, a voracious reader like you, a voracious reader. And I love to read science fiction, but I honestly don't think I have the patience to sit down and write a book. And just because so much of Dark Matter was tone, not just the character voices, but just the tone of the show. I don't like the idea of just hiring someone to write an ending for me. So the comic book realm would be an idea. I mean, I remember when the show was canceled, we approached Dark Horse Comics to see if they would be interested in continuing the story, but they weren't. So that kind of went away. But I mean, there's still that possibility. I spoke to Jay Firestone recently about it, and he likes the idea. I think he still hasn't given up on the hope of maybe landing a green light for a mini series that will allow me to say pick up the story, let's say 5 years later or 6 years later.
Oh, I hope so.
And, get the band back together, and close out some storylines.
That would be spectacular. Well, Joe, are there any projects that you can't talk about that you want to share with the listeners?
To be honest with you, I'm always juggling about 7 or 8 different projects, but it's all development work. So, I mean, there are, adaptations. We're going out and pitching. I'm writing pilots for various companies. I'm pitching sometimes some video game developers. So nothing that I can talk about. And at the end of the day, 9 out of 10, maybe 10 out of 10 will never see the light of day. I mean, one of the things I always tell people is when I look back on Dark Matter, at the time, Jay Firestone, who was the president of Prodigy Pictures, who was going out pitching the series, he came up empty. And I think I mentioned Sci-Fi Originals had passed, and we thought that was it. The door was closed.
Right.
And Dark Matter was dead. And another series that we had been developing looked like it was like one of 3 finalists for a network pickup. We thought, oh, this is the show. We were told it has the inside track. It's going to go. And then within 24 hours, we heard that show. In fact, all 3 shows that were up were out of contention, were out of the running. And then Jay ended up selling Dark Matter to Sci-Fi New York as an acquisition instead of an original, and which was great at the time, although because it had gone to Sci-Fi Originals first and they had passed, when they found out that Sci-Fi New York picked it up, they were unhappy. And then when we premiered and ended up beating their original series, they were really unhappy.
Right.
And so when season 3, after season 3 airs, and we kind of slipped a little in the ratings, but we were still like one of their top rated shows. And our point man in New York, Chris Regina, ended up moving to New York to Netflix. We no longer had a defender for the show. And so that's when they took the opportunity to cancel us. And that was very disappointing. Cancellations happen. I thought the reasons for the cancellations were somewhat dubious, but just the way it happened and the fact that, I was never personally contacted, and you would think, they would do it for showrunners, but also no one has produced more television for that network than me. Between Stargate and Dark Matter, respectfully, no one has. And I didn't get a call. And then Jay
they could have given you the courtesy of at least a call.
But Jay ended up emailing and asking, could we have the opportunity to maybe do a movie to close out the storyline for fans? And they didn't even respond.
Wow.
And so basically, I thought that was so disrespectful. I was like, oh, okay.
I agree.
And so basically that, it's not normally done, shall we say? But I was pretty mad. And I think it was very clear that I was pretty mad online with the way sort of it all went down. So
you were always gracious, though, and handled it with more tact than I probably would have.
Well, no. Well, it's funny because I think about months later, after like the whole tweet storm and everything, I remember actually every chance I got, I would always basically get in a dig. And I remember doing one post where I did, top 10 most evil organizations, and it was like Hydra and AIM and the various, Hammer Enterprises, and then I think Sci-Fi was like fell in at number 1, and my former writing partner, Paul Mully, ended up going to LA and doing kind of the Dog and Pony show. And he ended up having a meeting with the guy who canceled Dark Matter. And he walked into the room, and the first thing the guy said to him was, "So your writing partner likes to tweet, huh?" So apparently it was a very uncomfortable meeting, but
awkward. Yeah. Oh, well, they're lost. They're lost. Well, Joe, look, we've almost been talking for an hour, and I'm not going to keep you, but where can my listeners go to keep tabs on what you're doing? Would it be your blog?
You can find me everywhere, I would say. You can find me on my blog at josephmallozzi.com. Just do a search for my name. I blog every day and cover everything from what I'm working on to behind the scenes stuff to my dog, my ancient, almost 18-year-old pug. I'm always on the Stargate subreddits. Okay. So I'm posting to there. I have an Instagram account that I was going to shut down until I found out how to post from my laptop instead of my phone. And so I've been posting there as well. But
yeah, I noticed that.
Mainly Twitter. Twitter is where I do most of my interaction with fandom, where I'm always uploading concept art and answering questions. So come find me, Baron Destructo. Who else on Twitter?
Okay, and I'll make sure to include links too in the show notes of the podcast so that the listeners can have access to it. So, but Joe, thank you so much. I really have enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate you taking time to finally come on the podcast. And you always have an open invitation.
Thank you. You know what? I'm going to take you up on it. We should do like a bi-weekly or a weekly or bi-monthly get together where we can pick something. We can start reading comic books or reviewing horror movies. Let me know.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much. Take care, Joe.
Thanks, Rod. Take it easy.
And there you have it. The Eye on Sci-Fi podcast conversation with Joe Mallozzi. I want to thank Joe again for taking time to discuss his accomplished career in television and for also giving us a few hints as to what he is working on next. I'm going to include a link to Joe's long-running blog where you can keep tabs on him and all of his future projects. Just visit your podcast aggregator, or you may visit the7thmatrix.com and you will be taken directly to the show notes page of this episode. While you're visiting the Seventh Matrix, I encourage you to explore all of the other terrific indie science fiction and fantasy, online short films, web series, and other closely related media that we have curated on the site. I also need to ask you to visit our support section because without the support of kind and generous listeners like you, we would not be able to keep the lights on here at Eye on Sci-Fi Podcast and over at the Seventh Matrix, and we do appreciate that. Make sure to leave us a review and rating wherever you get your podcast, because that does help others find us, and we appreciate that a great deal as well. Okay, that's it for this episode, everyone. Thank you again for joining me. And until the Seventh Matrix portal reopens, stay safe and healthy out there. And remember, take a break, escape the mundane, and enter the fantastic. Take care.